Hey, welcome everybody. Joseph Clair, Executive Dean of the Cultural Enterprise at George Fox, my special guest, Pastor and Professor Dominic Doan. Dominic, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
And it's a pleasure to have you. Just a word about what it is we're up to. This is part of the university's George Fox Forum, which is a place for conversations in Christianity and Christian faith meeting culture, that sort of intersection of how does faith meet the world, rubber meets the road, critical conversations. And we're doing this digitally this year where we love doing panels on campus and lectures and hosting these conversations in person, but this year we're going virtual and it gives us a cool chance to reach different audiences. So thank you for being with us. You're my special guest, so I'll just sort of tee you up a little bit before we get to our conversation about calling today. And calling not only is the individual Christian's life, but our communal calling as Christians and as the church in this day and age, kind of in the pandemic and heading out of it. But you, Pastor Dom, are known to many of us as the lead pastor up at Westside at Jesus Church in Beaverton. It's a very vibrant congregation in the Portland metro area, and you're fantastic teacher in my mind. And you've been a pastor for a long time, pastored kind of here, there, and everywhere from Hawaii to Vanuatu. You've been in Mexico and a wide experience in the States, including North Carolina. You've also done a lot of study. You got your master's in theology at Oxford in 2012, and your bachelor's degree before that. You're an author of this hugely popular book, When Faith Fails, Finding God in the Shadow of Doubt, which I've heard you talk about, which is so helpful to me and so many other Christians who have a skeptical bone in our body and are always struggling to figure out how faith and doubt work to renew and enrich each other and not be enemies necessarily. And yet today I want to turn to the question of your new work. I know you're breaking ground or largely through a new work on calling. So if you could just give us the thumbnail, the elevator sketch of that new book, Dom.
Yeah. So, like you said, the last book, When Faith Fails, is kind of about the deconstruction process and what do we do when we go through those seasons of doubt. And this next book kind of builds on that just a little bit to ask the question, okay, coming into reconstruction, what next? How do we discover our calling? How do we discern the will of God? And I'm finding that so many people right now are really wrestling with that question. I came across some stats the other day that was confirming to me on this, that 65% of Americans feel like 2020 has sent them into a crisis of identity. 68% feel defeated, 61% feel alone, 48% feel hopeless. I mean, that's so sad. Half of us say, yeah, I just don't have any hope right now. The Barna group, they've done some research recently on this. They said that 40% of Christians, only 40% say they have a clear sense of God's call on their life. So that means even in the Christian community, 6 in 10 of us are like, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, where I'm supposed to go, what God is calling me to. And I think this has been a year of so much disruption. So it's been a year where, yeah, all the things we had planned for last year thrown out the window, and now we're just kind of left trying to rebuild. And so I think it's a good time to talk about calling, especially in a hopeless age, a confused age, a time when more and more people are trying to figure life out. Kind of reminds me of what Kierkegaard wrote. You know, he wrestled with calling in so much of his life. And I came across this journal of his, and he said, the thing is to understand myself, to see what God really wants me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die. I just love that. He says, you know, I want to figure out not only what I should live for, but what I would die for as well. He's trying to discern that sense of calling. And I think that's where so many of us are at right now. So the book wants to wade into those waters, kind of unpack what calling is, what the Bible has to say about calling, how Christianity makes sense of even the concept of calling. Because when you think about it, if you're gonna have a calling, you need a call giver. And if you look at other worldviews, a secular worldview or an atheistic worldview or even agnostic worldview, it's really hard to justify a sense of calling or purpose or telos, right? But Christianity makes sense of that. And so a large part of the book is going to be, okay, what does scripture have to say about calling? Maybe redefining some traditional ways that we've looked at calling in a way that I hope can be really refreshing and life-giving.
Oh man, sounds amazing. Send me a copy. One of the things that our listeners might not know about, our viewers might not know about you, is your role here at George Fox as professor of applied theology and helping out so many special projects. And it's been a gift to work in a lot of classes and Bible studies with you. And we get to talk about this stuff, but I haven't been able to ask you yet, since I heard about your new project, how the pandemic has shaped your own sense of calling. So those stats are really staggering, but as you were reeling them off, I'm like, oh yes, yes. I see and hear myself in those stats. This has been a strange, even if clarifying year for you. So I wonder, as you think about this year, how has your own sense of calling been formed, reformed, challenged? And how does that maybe fit into the larger kind of tapestry of your own journey of calling?
Yeah, man. Well, like everyone watching this, this has been a rough year. And I think so many times in the hardship, it really does force us to ask questions. Am I on the right track? Am I doing the right thing? The disruption sometimes is God's way of getting our attention, right? C.S. Lewis said that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And pretty much every one of us watching this have gone through this last year some seasons of pain and trial and suffering. Certainly for my own family, we lost two family members last year. And then just a few weeks ago, we had a scare with my wife, and her lung just spontaneously collapsed. Like, how does that even happen? It's this really rare thing that the doctors told us. Usually, a collapsed lung is because you get in a car accident or you get shot or whatever. And she just started feeling sick and took her to the emergency. And turns out that she would have died had we not gotten her in. And she spent 2 weeks in the hospital. There were some days like just wondering what's going to happen, right? And in the midst of all that, I think God gets our attention. And it's funny that I'm writing a book on calling right now because I'm in a place of just asking, okay, what is the next step? And Lord, are we where you want us to be? And are there things you want us to do? And so we're sifting through all that. I have a good friend who's a pastor in California, and I just love this practice. I think it can be applied virtually in any industry. But every single year, in the end of December, he gets away for a couple of days and he writes a letter of resignation. Every single year, he's like, God, okay, I'm resigning. And as he takes time to pray and seek God, if God says, nope, I still want you to continue on, then he'll continue on another year. And I think that's a really healthy practice. My friend Bob Goff, he says every Tuesday you should quit something. And so this is something actually he does every Tuesday. He'll quit something, whatever that is. And it could be something as big as your job or whatever. You're saying yes to a new opportunity or something small. And so I think there's something to that where we live lives where we're willing to risk. And this has been a year where so much of what we've been used to and comfortable with, certainly the way we'll talk about this, I'm sure, the way we've done church has changed. Things have changed. And so we need to be adaptable and pliable and willing to encounter God on the threshold of risk. Better to do that than to lose him in the comfort of mediocrity, right? So I'm there, as I'm sure you are, in that place of asking, okay, what are the next steps, God? Am I where you want me to be?
Yeah, no, it seems like a really healthy practice, both of those, the letter of resignation, the Tuesday quitting something. It speaks to, I think, this deeper awareness in seasons like this where you do potentially feel stifled. Or, I mean, it was so amazing on March 13th last year, although it didn't set in immediately, to watch like your stacked Google Calendar, just the days start to open up, right? All these things. And of course, that was in that kind of magical, painful transition between real life and virtual Zoom life. And so pretty soon it got full again over time with these virtual meetings. But it does make you question, like, what was I angling at with like the 19 hours of meetings every day? And like, for me, we're raising 4 young kids right now, and it's like, they're, super, pre-Italianate piano lessons on Tuesday and horse riding on Thursday, just all this stuff. You're just like, what are we doing with all this stuff? And the
Right.
hard reset of the
Yeah.
pandemic, I think, has been really clarifying to us. There's David Brooks wrote that cool book, The Second Mountain, that I think we've talked about
I love
before.
that book.
It says, man, you're really, and sometimes this is seasonally true of the first and second half of your life, but it can come in different ways. But you're on this achievement sort of driven, ambitious sort of ride up the first mountain where you're trying to make meaning through performance, achievement, sort of reputation. And at some point, something happens where you
Yeah.
start to realize that the mountain is not so, it's not the achievement mountain, it's the mountain of meaning that you're hungering
Yeah.
for. And that mountain is not climbed in the same acquisitive, ambitious, ego-driven way, but it actually often comes through losing things, letting go, serving, egolessness, and I think in some ways, wherever you were in the first and second mountain journey, 2020 has been this moment to ask you, like, have you been wrapped around things that actually aren't serving that broader, bigger, divine purpose that you've been called to?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this has been a year where culturally our idols have been stripped away, right? The sport's gone and all these things that we're used to doing, they disappeared. But once those things in our life, the busyness, the chaos, the packed calendars, all the things that we thought, made us valuable are being stripped away or redefined, it's a great opportunity, like David Brooks wrote about, to go deeper in our own soul. And that's really where calling begins, right? Calling in scripture is less about, where you should work or who you should marry or what job you should take or what you should major in or what show to watch next on Netflix, whatever, all the big questions of life. It's more about character. It's more about virtue. It's more about becoming the right person. And where I often get hyper focus is on, the specifics of calling, when God is more concerned about our central calling, right? And we work on being the right person. We work on being conformed into the image of Jesus. Then the other stuff just begins to happen, right? I heard it said before that you do what you know and you'll know what to do. And doing what you know, well, Augustine, you know this better than me. He talked about ordering your loves, right? And if our loves are ordered and focused around God, then our life is shaped ultimately around him, and our desires and affections are shaped around him, which influences our habits and vice versa, and our practices and vice versa. And then calling flows from that place of having an interior life that is devoted and flourishing, in tune and in sync with God.
Yeah. Oh man. So let me press a little farther. Then I appreciate how true calling is the ordering of one's loves and frees you from idolatry. But when does calling itself become idolatry? So there's another Kierkegaard quote, although I like the one you gave, where he talks about in either or how being modern is being free. And being modern means having a romantic marriage rather than an arranged marriage. And what does he mean by that? It's sort of a strange idea.
Yeah.
It means the big shift out of pre-modernity, whatever that was the move toward the freely chosen romantic marriage rather than the arranged marriage, which had to do with custom and family and location and religion, to this idea of like, I've got a romantic, passional connection with somebody out there in the cosmos. I need to find that one person. When I do, I'll feel it, we'll know it. It's the one. That's my destiny. Of course, there's something to that story, and it probably is my story, and I love it. But it comes with the collateral. Kierkegaard says is that you often struggle to know where your place in the world is. You're always thinking it's up to you to go out and to make the right series of choices to get yourself into this ultimate like nirvana spot of destiny where you married the right person, got the exact right job, you're doing all these things that add up in a certain way, and that becomes a idol, which is not only like a form of misworship, but its own kind of intense burden because you're under that dread that, and this often manifests, I think, in people wondering if their calling and their career or their job have overlapped adequately, thinking like, I'm not in the right calling because this job is not unleashing my creative potential or my, go down the list. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying like, can calling itself become an idol?
Totally. I mean, I could think of so many times in my life where it was an idol, where that's what we fixate on. I mean, the paradox of scripture is that to discover your calling, you have to die to it, right? You have to die, period. And you fall in love with the call giver. And from that, right, then he begins to show you what to do. But you're right. I think culturally, we have in many ways made an idol of calling. I mean, you think of all the "you be you" mantras that are out there, and a lot of the New York Times bestsellers are kind of built around this idea of just be your authentic self. Or what does that even mean, really? And so many times that can be a cover up for just do what you want. And in the name of authentic self, we hurt people and wound people because we're just trying to be true to ourselves. But scripture says, no, you die to yourself. And actually, great freedom is found in relationship. It's funny you mentioned Kierkegaard saying that. He was an interesting guy, too, talking about his romantic loves. But he once pointed out in another one of his, I think it was journals, that the word freedom in Danish comes from this word fry. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it's the same word that is used to describe when a man proposes to a woman. And she then has this opportunity to say yes. And if she says yes to that, she's entering into a covenant relationship with that person. And from the outside, love can sometimes look like bondage. And from the outside, you heard it said like, oh, the wedding ring is the world's smallest handcuff. Like, I don't want to be married. Some people say, I just want to be free, right? But those who are married, happily married, would say, actually, it's not bondage, it's freedom. It's something I love to be a part of. And I think Kierkegaard points this out because really the called life from the outside may look like bondage. What? You're following God, you're dying to yourself, you're choosing to serve others and love others, you're doing things that make no sense practically or financially in the name of following Jesus. Like from the outside, it makes no sense whatsoever. But from the inside, it looks like love. From the inside, it looks like relationship. From the inside, it's intimacy, right? I think calling is something like that. Calling is something like saying yes to the proposal. In fact, Peter in 2 Peter, when he says, make your calling and election sure, found this out a few weeks ago. It was really eye-opening to me. That word calling was used to describe a king who invited a peasant to a feast. And the peasant has nothing to bring to that feast. This isn't a potluck. It's not BYOB. All that peasant has to do, his only obligation is to say yes to the invitation. The king has laid a feast, a table before him. All he has to do is show up. And I think that too gets at the heart of calling. It's saying yes to a God that proposes. It's saying yes to the invitation of a king. It's stepping to the table he set before us. And the table, as we know in scripture, looks like broken bread and poured out wine. The table is a place of sacrifice. Calling is hard many times, but it's also a place of resurrection on the other side of that.
Oh man, so good. I I heard this said, it's not coming to me who said it, but this idea of it's the things that you chain yourself to ultimately that set you free. Because it's a kind of freedom that can only be known from the inside. So as you're saying, it's the freedom of love from within this covenantal long-term bonded commitment that when you're outside of it looking in, you can't get it. It does look like bondage or whatever. So I think, though, this brings up this other question. This is a nice segue to thinking about what we have in common with our callings and being a community and being a church. Even as we certainly live in the age of the cult of authenticity. I think that's the other gospel in many ways. Is it's the self-expressivist gospel, and it's captured in every great Disney movie that I watch with my kids, which is probably ruining their lives. But the message is clear, like, you are you. You're so special. There's all these forces in the world set up to not let you express who you really are. You need to stand against those forces at all costs and go out and let the true you out into the world. Let it go. I mean, that is the only other gospel on the market in popular culture sometimes. But I think there's another cult of freedom that I didn't see very clearly until 2020. I think it was always there, but now it's like really, really clear to see. And that is I've always known that Americans love our freedom, right? So
Mm.
that's clear, especially out here in the Northwest. We get the far out left and the right. They both love their freedom in different ways, and we kind of meet in some weird libertarian middle. But I think that part of what you're saying about the freedom that comes through commitment or connection or through
Mhm.
limitation is a deeper kind of freedom. It's a freedom for the good, for the true, for the
Yeah,
beautiful, for love, for something bigger than
yeah.
freedom itself. And there's an idolatrous potential where you worship freedom for its own sake. It's just purely like
Mhm.
freedom from any interference. Just don't mess with me. Get off my lawn. Don't tread on me, and then I'm happy. And I think there's always been this temptation to conflate freedom with happiness. Whereas in some ways, being totally free isn't good at all. It's what you're freed for,
Yeah.
what you're freed toward and for. And I guess the question is, what is our communal calling? So how does the individual call relate to the communal call to be people who do treasure freedom in ways
Mhm.
that it should be treasured because it's amazing, but also know how to serve the common good and to lay down our
Yeah.
freedoms and to lay down our individual rights or whatever to serve something which is much bigger than ourselves. Obviously, in the church, that's the kingdom of God. How do you think about that potential idolatry of the cult of freedom, let's call it?
Oh man. Well, I think one of the reasons that you see the church in the New Testament and God's community in the Old Testament is to be really a new way of living as free people, but it's together in pursuit of the common good, right? As you were sharing that, I was thinking of Ephesians 4, where it says, equip God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So it's not so much freedom from, that's part of the gospel, but it's also freedom for. And we've been called to something. When God created Adam and Eve and he placed them in a garden, there's a great deal of freedom there, but they were also given a vision and a mission, right? Name the animals and love each other and love me and walk with me in the cool of the day and cultivate this earth. So they were given a very specific task in their freedom, right? God didn't create them to retire. He didn't say, okay, I made you, here's the garden, now retire, play bingo, move to Florida, whatever. He gave them a very specific task. And I think that's really liberating, actually, is the freedom that we have can be used to bring the freedom of Jesus to the broken parts of our world. And we do this together. We do it in community. And this is why, over this last year, church, in many ways, we got to rethink how to do church and how to do community, in a time of quarantine and such. But I think coming out of this pandemic, there's going to be a greater need for that solidarity and community and bringing freedom to those who are struggling with its idea.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I want to get back to that of coming out of the pandemic as church and what kinds of stirrings, you were already getting a sense of what life on the other side of this might or might not look like. It's obviously not just going to disappear, evaporate when the vaccine shows up. But I also think we're starting to see where the hunger
Yeah.
might lie. But before we get there, I guess I want to know from your perspective, and this was pre-pandemic certainly, is how we got to the point where so many of us, and myself included, can imagine the Christian life apart from church. So it's a common
Mm.
trope, especially out here in the Northwest, to think about being a Christ follower saying something like, I love Jesus, but not the church, or I hate the church, really
Yes.
separating between the
Yeah.
two. And of course, from a biblical Pauline perspective, totally impossible. Like Christ is present in the
Yeah.
body, mysteriously, and you can go down that road. And yet you have people that are just fully okay with a more individualized kind of Christian calling. How did we get there? Is that wrong or bad or misguided? Will it change on the other side of COVID? What do you think?
Yeah. I think a lot of the stats that we've seen leading up to COVID have really accelerated over this last year. So coming out of it, I think things are going to look slightly like they were, but worse in some ways. But there's also opportunity there. How we got there, I think, has to do, at least partially, with this cult of authenticity and this idea that the individual is everything. And it's just you and God and Cannon Beach or whatever. You don't really need community. You don't need the church. And one of the excuses people, will give to justify that, and I get it, I understand it, is they'll say, well, the church is full of hypocrites, right? And to which I'd say, absolutely. I ran into a guy a couple of years ago and hadn't seen him around church for a while. And he's like, I don't go to church anymore. I don't need it. Just so many hypocrites there, the typical answer. And I say, well, there's always room for one more. Right? You should come back. We're all hypocrites. We're all broken. And I think rather than using that as an excuse to distance ourselves from community, we can instead ask the question, okay, maybe I do see things in my local church I hate. Maybe I do see things I disagree with, but how can I be a redemptive presence to bring healing there? How can I be a part of the answer? Right? That's the sad thing, is when people leave the church under the guise of, oh, they're just a bunch of hypocrites. Well, we actually need you to be a part of it, to bring healing, to bring wholeness, to address those things that you feel need to be addressed. And what are the parts of the church that you wish they did more of? Okay, what would it look like for you to step into that? Right? And so many times we define the church, or we get mad at a church because we view it as an organization. And it's easy to see it that way, but biblically, it's not an organization; it's an organism. It's alive. It's a bride. It's his body. It's very tactile. It's very, very physical. And just like that passage, I looked at in Ephesians 4, every single one of us has a part to play in the body of Jesus. Every single one. Some are hands; they just love to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty and do practical stuff. Some are the feet, and they just have a heart for mission. Others are the mouth, and they're gifted in communication. Others are the eyes. They can see things. They have vision. I mean, every part of the body matters. You may appreciate this. I was reading recently about belly button bacteria. It sounds really random, but what we're discovering is, like, the unseen parts of the body are just as important. So the body is 10 trillion cells, but 100 trillion bacteria cells. So we are 10 times more bacteria than we are human. In fact, in our belly button, this will gross people out, but in our belly button alone, there are 2,300 species of bacteria, just in our belly button, right? So, but what we're finding is actually, even the bacteria matters. And I think even in church, right? Someone may not know what their role is. Or maybe they're the bacteria, the belly button bacteria. There's a vital role for them. There's a part to play. It might be unseen. It might be behind the scenes. It could be prayer. It could be praying with people before, after a gathering. It could be something, that's more visible. But every single person matters. Every single person has a place at the table, right?
Yeah.
And freedom looks like broken people gathering together around a table, saying yes to the King who's inviting us there, and then joining him in his mission to renew and restore all things. And why church? Well, I don't know. I mean, Jesus could have done it a lot better himself. He could have sent an army of angels to set up churches. Why he chose people like us, I have no idea. It's probably something to do with love. But that is the way there's no plan B, right? That is his plan, to bring healing and restoration. It's the church, it's the bride, it's God's people, his hands and his feet, to bring more Jesus to a broken world.
Oh man, it's brilliant. I think in some ways it's so simple, right? There, you read the New Testament, the church is this called, gathered body of people who want to follow Jesus. They feast on his word in reading and preaching, and they celebrate and remember his death and resurrection and communion and baptism for many churches. And there's discipleship, there's relationships, there's worship to God, there's service of each other and to the world. It's kind of a simple formula. And yet I was talking to someone this week they were already struggling to just stay a remainder in the church, fight for the importance of that communal calling and not just the individual kind of private spiritual quest. But they're like, this age of polarization where the church is like mirroring the world in terms of left and right, whether it's face masks and social justice, pick your things. And it's like just digging in the heels, mapping onto our own culture wars has put a sour taste in their mouth. And those are totally complex moral, political, philosophical issues. But I do think the question is, why is the church being, for lack of a better term, co-opted in some ways, or mirroring this kind of
Mm.
divisive political context we find ourselves? And is there a calling beyond that, out of this, that we need to hear?
Oh man, that is such a good question because I think across America we're seeing churches divide over some of the issues that you talked about. And I think in many, many ways, and it's so sad, it's a sad indictment. But in many ways, the church has forgotten its politic. We've become obsessed and enamored with the politics of our nation. And not to say there isn't a place for that, but we've forgotten our primary politic, right? I mean, Paul, he said Philippians 3, our citizenship is in heaven. And that word citizenship, as you know, is where we get our English word for politics. So he's saying your politic is in heaven, which what that means is we have a new identity. In Ephesians, he talks about how we're a part of the new humanity, right? The body, members of his household, united by the Spirit. And what's striking to me about that phrase when he says, you know, your citizenship, your politic is in heaven, when he's writing this, is that he's speaking into a time, into a culture that was deeply divided. I mean, we think we're divided. Back then, there are all kinds of fault lines and divisions. They're divided by religion. They were divided by economics. You had the very, very, very wealthy that constituted, you know, vast majority of the wealth, and then everyone else. You had social structures that divided people. Geography divided people. Politics divided people. And you can go through that list, and it's like, check, check, check. I think we all can relate, right? I think it was the Associated Press a couple months ago said that we're more divided than ever. Gridlocked was the word they used, over social issues, race, gender, and the economy. So we're kind of living in what Paul described in Ephesians and Philippians. But it's in that divided age where Paul reminds us as followers of Jesus, our identity isn't in political systems. It's not in ideologies. It's not in economic divisions. We are a new humanity. We're no longer foreigners, but fellow citizens, and we're being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives. And there can be a unity in diversity. And here's my big fear, Joseph, is I fear that the churches now are dividing over race issues, political issues, Trump issues, whatever. Just go through the list. They're dividing. And we're accelerating a cultural problem right now in America, where we're all within our own echo chambers of our own opinions and our own thoughts, and we just follow people online who think like us, and our news sources just reflect us, right? And we're doing that with church now, and it's so tragic. Like, we've developed and started all these churches where, okay, if you're a Trump supporter, this is where you go. If you're into QAnon, this is where you go. If you're into progressive issues, this is where you go. If you're into whatever, and you can just find your community that's going to reflect you. But the problem with that is we don't grow when it's through uniformity. We grow through diversity. And what was so beautiful about the early church and the way that they responded to the cultural pressures and time in which they live was to gather together, rich, poor, free, slave, men, women. And they're creating a new society that welcomed all who bore the name of Jesus, like into this ethnic oriented world that divided people, Jew and Greek, barbarian, Roman. The Christians, they're really embodying a new kind of gathering place, right? It's the new humanity. And that's, oh man, that's my prayer for the church today,
Yeah.
and for universities too, that we could embody and really put on display what diversity looks like. It's okay to have different perspectives. You know, my dream for our church is like, I want people all across the political spectrum. I want people who have all these different views, and we may have nothing in common but Jesus, but that's enough.
Mm.
That's enough. And if we as a church can't do it, then what message are we sending to culture?
Oh man, that's that's it. I was stunned by that the other day, because we're not immune to the atmosphere in which you live, and you can find your mind going down whenever you interact with someone thinks differently about something really important to you, morally, politically, socially, whatever. And it's like I can just watch the steps in my mind of like, yeah, the person
Yeah.
is yada yada yada. And then the thought crossed my mind, knowing this person loves Christ and is a Christian, probably a better Christian than me. I'm like, that's a lot to have in common with that person, that's a
Mm.
lot. And so how does that build a bridge? So I guess practically, I mean, given you shepherd, this mass, wonderful congregation, what are the practical steps? What are the resources for resistance to this hyper echo chambered world we live in?
I think it's coming to the table and having broken bread and a poured out cup and reorienting our politic, our identity around Jesus.
Mm,
Really, I mean that to me is the answer. And then serving together, joining Jesus in his mission to renew and restore all things.
mm,
When Jesus sat at the disciple with his friends, they were across the board politically. I mean, gosh, there was a guy there who's a zealot who wanted to destroy Rome, carried around knives just to be ready at any moment for revolution. And then there's a tax collector, a guy who worked for Rome, right? We talk about a diverse group of people,
mm.
complete polar. It'd be like having a member of ISIS and Antifa, right? The same thing. Like, what? Serious? But Jesus chose people from across the spectrum because
Mm.
he wanted to do something new, and he wanted to reach all people. The gospel is cross cultural, right?
Wow.
And I think Jesus' vision for the church in a hyper polarized age is the table, a place, a new gathering place where we can gather together, lay aside our differences, but find our common humanity and
Mm.
find our common identity in Jesus.
Oh man. Yes, Lord. That's what we want. So let me just say, I think you put your finger diagnosing one of the great challenges for a communal calling of any sort in this age. And this was true pre-pandemic, but it's more true now. And that is, I think we as creatures, we have a couple strong inclinations, desires, itches. One of them is for sociality and communication, conversation, right? Like Aristotle's whole idea, we're the talking animal, the gregarious animal. That's what sets us apart from so many other animals. So we're social animals, and we love to learn and get information, and we especially love to learn things about spiritual realities and bigger ideas and all those things. Those two desires for a long time would have driven you out of your home, even your neighborhood, to a place like a church, to meet
Mm.
people, to talk, to hear a sermon, to interact with the word, all these things. The internetization of our lives, right? Which has come with
Yeah.
all sorts of cool byproducts, the democratization of knowledge around the world, all these things. It's scratching those itches in a really deep way, right? So you interact. I mean, how many of us are happy thumbs all day long interacting with people
Mm.
far, far away from us on our phones? How many of us are scratching that itch to learn and to grow? And I mean, you can hear the best teachers on anything for free right now on YouTube. So what that does though is it drives us out of interacting in reality with people around those ideas and for social reasons, because it's a virtual thing. Again, I'm not
Yeah.
anti-tech Luddite all the way down. I'm just saying that we've gone through like a mass, what would you call it, like an excarnation or a disincarnation of our moral and spiritual and intellectual lives. A lot of it is virtual, and the difference is just what you were saying is when you had to go out to meet people on the street or in the church or in the temple to interact on that level, you realize something really quick is people and ideas are much more complex. And the conversation reveals to you that there's people that maybe don't share that idea, but you had a really good conversation with them,
Right.
or they had a really good idea that challenged you, like all that kind of natural, complexity and humanity that you're talking about,
Mm.
not relativistically, but just the way that humans and ideas come in concrete lived particular human reality
Mm.
is
Mhm.
lost in a certain way in these echo chambers. So things become more and more purified and sort
Mhm.
of opposed in a way that's not real when you just put the laptop down, go walk down to the coffee shop and have an amazing
Mhm.
conversation with someone who's wearing the wrong t-shirt or whatever. It challenges that kind of presumption. So I guess, man, so to the resources of resistance, how do we as church become a site, become a place for that kind of formation, that kind of invitation around the table after this? Like, what's it going to be? What's the church going to look like ideally on the other side of this?
It will look different. And I think the challenges will be immense moving forward. I've been hearing from different pastors across the nation who are starting to regather now. And really across the board, they're seeing about 3, maybe 4 in 10 people are coming back. In some cases, it's a lot lower. So far less people are coming back now. And one reason for that is they've been kind of discipled into thinking that virtual church is church, right? I was sharing this with our church the other day, how I'm thankful that we can stream gatherings and do all that. I think it's a wonderful thing in times of pandemic and emergency and snow days like we had the other day. It's a great thing. But I don't think long term we can actually call staring at an iPhone, watching someone talk or listen to some people play songs. I don't think we can call that church just theologically. And I think there needs to be a deep rethink of how do we disciple people into their calling? How do we disciple people into mission? How do we disciple people into unity in a fractured age when people have been discipled into thinking that everything's virtual? And I think there's going to be an urgent need to step out of the virtual space and to cast a fresh vision of what embodied presence looks like. Again, hands and feet, right? The body, it's physical, it's tactile. And beauty happens, reconciliation happens, not online, but face to face. I mean, I've been a part of conversations where you have 2 people sitting across from each other who were spewing hatred on Facebook, just the angriest things. And then saying, hey, we should probably connect. Let's meet up, right? It's probably not good you guys are doing that. And then they'll sit down, these 2 people, and it's like all the hate's gone, all the anger's gone. There's almost a sense of shame, like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Like, it's a real person you're talking to. And I think culturally we're gonna have to figure that out, because the more we just are on our phones stuck at home, the more angry and polarized we're gonna be. And I think, opens up a whole nother conversation, what we've seen happen this last year in the media and politically. But the church has to be a place where we fight to have unity in our diversity. We're coming to the table, we're focusing on Jesus, we're reorienting our story, framing our story around the kingdom politic and serving together. And that just, it's going to take time. It's going to take real intentional discipleship and connecting people tangibly, physically to one another.
Man, so good. I wonder, so to kind of bring us in for a landing, I wonder if you could tie that back together with where we started, individual calling. The church as streamed infotainment opportunity, right? So it's like a stellar, and I say this, humbly, because I feel myself wanting and aspiring to be these things, but it's like the streamed infotainment moment of the Christian polished TED talker and awesome band, right? And it's 45 minutes to an hour, and it's like, you don't know if you're on YouTube or in reality. It's just, this is the spirit of the age, this length of a talk with this style and this kind of music, and it hits all the buttons. And again, church always is trying to be relevant, and there's always costs and benefits to that. But where did we maybe go astray, and where do we need to correct course coming out of this? Thinking about the individual and communal calling of the church to be a place of unity and discipleship and service. So we live in this age, man, that is just saturated with human glory, I guess, as it always been, which is, we love achievement. I mean, it's all about, it's the Tom Bradyism of the world. I mean, these are our heroes, right? They're just like at the apex of their creative, physical, intellectual powers, and there's achievements. And again, there's something kind of awe-inspiring and beautiful about that. but then we created a whole economy and marketing machine around selling the experience of the aura of that glory. So it's not just the
Mm,
glory itself, but it's actually our ability to capture it and touch it in some way, take a selfie with it or put it on your
mm,
feed. And I think in some ways, I wonder if we as the church have been co-opted and taken captive by the cult of glory and fame and recognition, such that we can't even remember what our authentic communal calling is to these more humble, slow,
mm.
painful, beautiful arts of service, of discipleship, of unity. I mean, do you think that's right? And how do we correct course coming out of this?
It's so right. Man, I mean, earlier I mentioned how this last year has caused the collapse of many of our cultural idols. And I think that's been true in evangelicalism as well. You know, whether it's a collapse of high profile Christian leaders, as we've seen over the last month and last year, but even the collapse of defining church as some kind of ultra polished TED talk with, you know, an amazing band, um, that's been stripped away. And here's the great thing is that in in that stuff being stripped away is the opportunity for the rebirth of something authentic. The early church didn't have sound systems. They didn't have ultra polished gatherings. It's somewhat messy, right? But the greatest revival the world has ever seen took place through the mess.
Mm,
And this is where, you know, in the conversation where we've been highlighting a lot of the things that have gone wrong, this is where I'm actually super excited, because I think out of this can rise a new version of church that is actually more true to use the phrase, its authentic self, what it was meant to be. Parker Palmer has an interesting book, and he talks about how when we're younger, we have these innate interests. We have a sense of calling, things we're into. We're very honest. But as we get older, we tend to put up walls in our life because we want to conform to society, want to conform to expectations, or walls because of hurt or things we've gone through. And so as we get older, he says that there's a disconnect between our soul and our role. And I think the same thing happens in the life of the church, where there has been a disconnect between the soul of the church and the role of the church. And we've tried to be one thing to appeal or be edgy or whatever to reach culture. But we need to get back to our soul when we're actually true to who God has called us to be.
mm,
We strip down some of these walls. Then that's, I think, the space where God's Spirit does beautiful things. There's revival that happens there in this organic place. The organism has an opportunity to breathe. And I think this is an opportunity now for the church to live without walls,
mm,
because the walls have been stripped down, and to get back to our soul of
mm,
who Jesus says we are, and to see the opportunity in this.
mm,
And one opportunity that we have is the gospel brings hope, and we are in a time of profound hopelessness, profound weariness, a time when people are profoundly disillusioned with the systems politically in our nation. And we have an opportunity now to bring people back to a kingdom politic, and to
mm.
the person of Jesus. And to the degree that we can step into that calling is the degree we're going to see new birth, new opportunity, new growth, and revival. And I really believe it. I think God is going to do something new. I think it will probably happen with the emerging generation,
Mhm.
because I think they get it. They see the systems that have been in place for years that are just not true to who God has called us to be, and God's original vision for church and following Jesus. They get it. And I think the emerging generation will be a spearhead for this new work that God wants to do. So I'm really excited to see what that looks like in the years ahead.
Oh man, what a great place to finish. I feel like it's a hopeful word because of the despairing context we're in, but it's such a great realignment. I think in some ways we're coming to the end of this 50-year run post kind of 1960s cultural revolution where we've seen the church. I feel like in some ways there have been moments of life and revival, but it's been a kind of stagnant splitting between protecting what's old on one side and just a total, kind of cultural accommodation in some ways on the others. And I think we're just hungry for breaking new ground. And how wonderful to
Yeah.
think that it's not about purely defending and protecting or purely trying to engage and be relevant, but it's something new. It's something about the kingdom. It's led by a spirit and it's focused on Jesus. And in that focus comes the truest form of freedom, that self-forgetful love, which is Christ, which is the spirit flowing in and out of us. So thank you so much, Dom, for your great words. So good to be with you. I think the good news is we're going to do this again. We're going to make this a habit, a practice. We're going to do more of these. So more to come. Stay tuned. Thank you. If you made it this far with us, I know we enjoyed it and we hope you did too. So thanks so much.